After 12 years of transforming Thorn Development Corporation, I finally achieved what seemed impossible: a $75 million valuation. The company my father had built from nothing was now a powerhouse in real estate development, thanks to my relentless dedication. Yet here I sat at our family's annual corporate gala, watching my father, Roland Thorne, raise his glass with that familiar self-assured smile, about to shatter everything I'd built. As we celebrate 30 years of Thorne development, he announced to the room full of board members and elite clients, his hand resting proudly on my brother Wesley's shoulder, "I'm pleased to announce that Wesley will be taking over as CEO." The crystal champagne glass nearly slipped from my fingers. My chest tightened, but years of boardroom battles had taught me to maintain my composure. I smiled, channeling every ounce of control I'd learned from countless negotiations. Around the elegant dining room of the Metropolitan Club, champagne flutes clinked as our guests processed the announcement. This wasn't just another corporate dinner. This was supposed to be my moment of triumph. I still remember every detail of that night: the soft glow of the chandeliers, the murmur of congratulations directed at Wesley, the way my mother Evelyn's eyes darted between us, her face a mask of careful neutrality. My Stanford MBA, the weekends I'd sacrificed, the deals I'd closed. None of it seemed to matter in the face of my father's traditional values. I watched Wesley receive handshakes and backslaps, his practiced modesty doing little to hide the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. My younger brother, who'd spent the past decade jumping between failed startups, suddenly positioned to lead the company I'd rebuilt. The irony was almost laughable. The weight of my mother's gaze from across the table felt heavy. She understood what this meant, had witnessed every sacrifice I'd made. But like always, she remained silent, unwilling to challenge my father's decisions. Roland Thorne's word was law, both in business and family. As I raised my glass in a toast I didn't mean, my mind was already racing through documents, contracts, and shareholding agreements. "To Wesley," I said smoothly, my voice betraying none of the calculations happening behind my smile. The guests joined in, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface of our picture-perfect family moment. Wesley caught my eye across the table, his expression a mixture of triumph and challenge. That's when I knew this wasn't just my father's decision. My brother had been orchestrating this, playing the prodigal son who'd finally found his calling. But what neither of them realized was that I'd spent the last 12 years doing more than just running the company. I'd been securing my position within it. Tomorrow morning would change everything. And neither my father nor Wesley had any idea what was coming. The next morning, at precisely 8:45 a.m., I walked into Thorne Development's headquarters, my heels echoing against the marble floors of the lobby I'd redesigned 3 years ago. The same modern architecture, the same efficient atmosphere I'd cultivated, but today felt different. Today wasn't about management. It was about ownership. The reception area buzzed with an unusual tension. News travels fast in corporate circles, and my father's announcement had already spread through every department. Employees glanced at me with uncertain expressions, their loyalty wavering between tradition and performance. I moved past them with measured steps, my expression neutral but confident. I reached my corner office, the one I'd earned through countless late nights and successful deals, and closed the door behind me. 15 minutes. That's all I had before my father and Wesley would arrive, expecting to begin their grand transition of power. 15 minutes before their carefully laid plans crumbled. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating my desk where a stack of carefully prepared documents lay waiting. I powered on my computer, accessing the files I'd spent years quietly accumulating. The executive shareholding agreement glowed on my screen, its contents about to reshape our entire family dynamic. At exactly 9 o'clock, A sharp knock echoed through my office. I didn't bother responding. The door opened to reveal Roland and Wesley Thorne, both radiating confidence. My father's earned, through decades of traditional business practices. Wesley's borrowed from our family name. Maddie, my father said, using that tone he reserved for important business matters. I trust you're prepared to begin the transition process. I leaned back in my chair, observing them both. Wesley stood slightly behind our father, wearing an expensive suit that looked too new, too carefully chosen for this moment. His smirk hadn't faded since last night. The transition, I repeated, keeping my voice level. Yes, let's discuss that. You'll need to start bringing Wesley up to speed on all our major projects, my father continued, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. His tone carried that familiar authority that had once made me jump to attention. We want this to be as smooth as possible. I watched Wesley position himself by the window, his reflection showing that same self-satisfied smile. Don't worry, sis, he said, his casual tone grating against my nerves. I've been studying the business. I know what I'm doing. The urge to laugh was almost overwhelming. Studying the business. While I'd been in the trenches, transforming our company from a regional player into a national force, Wesley had been finding himself through a series of failed ventures, each one funded by our father's patience and checkbook. I see, I said softly, reaching for my remote. The large screen on my office wall flickered to life, displaying the document I'd prepared. Then you'll both be familiar with this? The executive shareholders' agreement appeared, dated 3 years ago, bearing all our signatures. My father's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. A shareholders' agreement. Wesley shrugged, clearly missing the significance. So what? So, I said, standing up slowly. This document, which you both signed, clearly states that any transfer of executive power requires approval from all majority shareholders. I paused, letting the words sink in. And I, as it happens, hold 60% of Thorne Development's shares. The silence that followed was deafening. Wesley's smirk vanished. That's impossible, Wesley muttered, stepping closer to examine the document. His perfect composure cracked further with each line he read. Actually, it's very possible, I replied, my voice maintaining its professional calm. While you were busy launching your tech startups, and Dad was playing the role of corporate patriarch, I was carefully building my position. I turned to face my father, whose expression had hardened into stone. Remember the capital we needed for the West Coast expansion in 2020? You signed over 15% of your shares to me. And during the Thompson lawsuit in 2021, another 10% was transferred as collateral, which you never reclaimed. Add that to my original 35%, and well. I gestured to the documents. The math is quite clear. My father's jaw clenched. Wesley was already in panic mode, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. You have to be bluffing, he spat. Without a word, I pulled out the most recent legal filings and handed them over. Feel free to verify the numbers. Wesley snatched the papers, his hands trembling slightly as he read. The color drained from his face with each passing second. You can't do this, he stammered, looking desperately at our father. Dad, tell her she can't do this. Roland Thorne remained silent, his eyes fixed on me. He knew I had outmaneuvered him completely, and there was nothing he could do about it. I straightened my posture, smoothing my skirt as I stood. I'm not firing you, Wesley, I said calmly. I wouldn't want to force you into actually having to find a real job. You can keep your position here, reporting to me, or... I gestured toward the door. You're free to leave with a fair buyout of your remaining shares. Wesley turned to our father, his eyes pleading for a solution. But for the first time in his life, Roland Thorne had no answers, No way to fix his son's problems. Because this wasn't his company anymore. It was mine. In the office. The silence in my office felt suffocating. Wesley still clutched the legal documents, his knuckles white from gripping them too hard. Roland stood rigid beside him, his face a mask I'd seen him wear during countless difficult negotiations. But this time, he was on the losing side. I could see him calculating, searching for any loophole, any weakness in my position. There wasn't one. I'd spent years preparing for this moment, not because I'd expected betrayal, but because experience had taught me that in the world of real estate development, power was everything. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me as if he was truly seeing me. Not as his daughter, not as a temporary caretaker of his legacy, but as someone who had outsmarted him at his own game. So that's it? Wesley finally broke the silence, his voice thick with bitterness. You're just taking everything. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. Taking everything? I stepped closer to him. Wesley, I built this company into what it is today. Every major projects, every expansion, every technological innovation, that was all me. While you were burning through startup capital, I was turning Thorn Development into a powerhouse. So no, I'm not taking anything. I met his gaze directly. I'm keeping what I earned. Wesley's face contorted with anger, but he had no counter-argument. We both knew the truth. And worse, so did our father. Roland finally spoke, his voice measured but strained. You're making a mistake, Maddie. He tried to maintain his authoritative tone, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath. A family business should stay in the family. Do you really want to burn this bridge? I met his gaze steadily. Dad, I said slowly, you burned that bridge the moment you made your decision without consulting me. His lips pressed into a thin line. Business is bigger than any one person. We can find a compromise. I tilted my head slightly, feigning consideration. Oh, I agree with you about compromise. That's why I'm offering you both a choice. I turned to Wesley first, maintaining my professional demeanor. You can stay with Thorn Development in an advisory role. The salary will be generous, but you'll report directly to me. Or, I paused, letting the alternative sink in. You can walk away. I'll buy out your remaining shares at market value, and you'll be free to pursue your next venture. My father scoffed. You're acting like you hold all the cards. That's because I do, I replied simply. The time for pretense was over. The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of the office beyond my door. I let them sit with the reality of their situation, let them experience what it felt like to be powerless. Finally, my father exhaled heavily, shaking his head in disbelief. I never thought you'd do this, he muttered. Not to your own family. I felt a sharp twinge at his words. Not to your own family. The irony of him using that line after what he'd just tried to do wasn't lost on me. I wanted to remind him that he was the one who had attempted to push me aside, to treat my years of dedication as temporary. But I didn't, because in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was ensuring that no one could ever threaten what I'd built. Wesley was the first to break. He stormed out of my office, slamming the door behind him. I knew what would come next. He'd run to our family friends, our business associates, playing the victim of corporate betrayal. Let him. I wasn't here to win a popularity contest. I was here to secure my future. Roland lingered, perhaps waiting for me to soften, to show some sign of backing down. When I didn't, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. You've changed, he said quietly. I met his gaze one final time. No, Dad. I just finally stopped pretending. Then he too left, leaving me alone in my office, in my company. Later that morning, I exhaled slowly, settling back into my chair. I should have felt triumphant. I had fought for my position and won. But as I stared at the empty doorway, I felt something else, a quiet, persistent ache that I couldn't quite shake. Some small part of me had always craved my father's approval, had believed that if I worked hard enough, proved myself enough times, he would finally see me for who I was. But the truth was, he had never really looked. And now he had no choice but to see me not as his daughter, not as his temporary CEO, but as the woman who had outmaneuvered him and taken control of Thorn Development. I turned to my computer, focusing on what needed to be done next. I had spent 12 years building this company from a struggling regional developer into a national powerhouse. Now I would spend the next 12 making it untouchable. My father and brother had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they were the ones who had lost it all. The familiar rhythm of work helped steady me. There were projects to oversee, deals to close, meetings to attend. The business didn't stop just because my family dynamics had imploded. If anything, I needed to be more focused, more decisive than ever. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I knew my father wouldn't walk away quietly. And Wesley, he would fight tooth and nail to reclaim what he saw as his birthright. I wasn't naive enough to think this was the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in the Thorn family saga. By noon, I could already feel the subtle shift in the company's atmosphere. Employees who had greeted me confidently last week now seemed hesitant, unsure where their loyalties should lie. A few department heads avoided eye contact in the hallways. The whispers had begun. I knew exactly what was happening. Roland and Wesley were already working their connections, longtime family friends, board members, senior executives. They were spreading their narrative, painting me as cold, ruthless, disloyal. Wesley had especially embraced his role as the wounded son, betrayed by his own sister. I could picture him now, sitting in some upscale restaurant, his voice heavy with practiced sorrow, as he told our investors how I had stolen the company. And Roland, he wouldn't need to say much. Just a disappointed sigh, a shake of his head, and those carefully chosen words. I only wanted what was best for both my children. It was calculated and dangerous. If they managed to turn enough board members and executives against me, they could make my leadership impossible. I refused to let that happen. That afternoon, I called an emergency executive meeting. As I walked into the boardroom, the tension was palpable. Half the executives avoided my gaze. The others watched too intently, waiting for any sign of weakness. I took my place at the head of the table, my rightful place. "Let's be direct," I began, my voice steady. "I know there have been conversations happening behind closed doors over drinks, in hushed tones." I let my gaze sweep across the room, meeting each person's eyes long enough to make them shift uncomfortably. "Some of you are questioning whether my leadership is sustainable." Several people tensed visibly. No one spoke. I tapped my finger against the polished mahogany table, then brought up a presentation on the screen. "Let's look at the facts. Under my leadership, Thorn Development has grown from a regional player to a $75 million industry leader. In the past 5 years alone, we've seen a 300% increase in revenue and expanded into 6 new markets." I turned to our CFO, Michael. "Do we have any financial indicator suggesting this company is struggling under my leadership?" Michael hesitated, then shook his head. "No. In fact, our projections show another 20% growth next quarter." "Then let's be honest about what's really happening here," I continued, leaning forward. "My father and brother aren't concerned about this company's performance. They're not worried about my capabilities as a leader. They're upset because they expected me to step aside and let Wesley take over, regardless of his qualifications, regardless of our results. The room remained silent. Then I revealed my next card. I also know that some of you have been contacted in the last 24 hours, offered incentives to push for my removal. I tilted my head slightly. If anyone would like to share those conversations now, this is your opportunity. The tension in the room thickened. Finally, David Richardson, one of our senior executives, cleared his throat. I received a call, he admitted. From your father. He mentioned making an official appeal to the board. I nodded, unsurprised. And did he offer anything in return for your support? A pause. Then a reluctant nod. I see. I stood up, commanding the room's full attention. Roland Thorne founded this company, I acknowledged. I won't deny that. But I took it further than he ever could have. And I will not allow him or anyone else to manipulate it from the outside. I let my voice drop slightly, my tone controlled, but carrying a clear warning. If anyone in this room believes my father and brother deserve control, now is the time to make your position known. Silence. Not a single person moved. Excellent. I gathered my materials and walked out, my head held high. This wasn't just about maintaining control of my company. This was about ensuring they never thought they could take it from me again. That night, I made a strategic decision. Not to call a board member, not to reach out to investors, but to contact the media. By morning, every major business publication would have the story. Power shift at Thorne Development. Madeline Thorne secures control in boardroom battle. I had made my move. Now it was their turn. The next day, my inbox exploded the morning after the story broke. A flood of emails, missed calls, and messages from journalists, investors, and board members. The responses varied from supportive to cautious, but most carried the same underlying question. Is it true? I let them wait. I understood my father's game perfectly. He had spent decades mastering the art of public perception in the real estate world. He knew that reputation carried weight in our industry. If he couldn't defeat me in the boardroom, he would try to undermine me in the public eye. By noon, his counterattack arrived. A press release, masterfully crafted, carefully worded, but filled with calculated implications. Thorne Development has always been a family-led enterprise. We are saddened by recent developments, but remain committed to upholding the values that built this company. Changes in leadership are inevitable, and we hope to transition smoothly as we move forward. The subtlety wasn't lost on me. The message was clear. Madeline is reckless. Madeline is unstable. Madeline isn't a team player. I sat in my office, watching industry analysts debate my leadership on business news channels. Is Madeline Thorne too aggressive in her takeover? Will her lack of cooperation damage the company? Can she recover from this PR crisis? They discussed me as if I wasn't watching, as if I wasn't already calculating my next move. Because if Roland and Wesley wanted a public war, I would give them exactly that. I didn't issue a statement. I didn't call a press conference. Instead, I made one phone call to an old friend in investigative journalism. I have something for you, I said. But you'll need to move quickly. 1 hour later. Within the hour, I sent over a carefully curated package of documents, internal records, financial reports, emails, evidence that Thorne Development under my father's leadership had engaged in questionable business practices, ones I had spent the last decade quietly correcting and restructuring. The story broke within 24 hours. Behind the scenes at Thorne Development, a legacy of hidden debts and financial cover-ups. The article was devastating in its precision. It praised my leadership for stabilizing the company's financial health. It criticized my father's past mismanagement. And most importantly, it proved that I was the reason Thorne Development had survived and thrived. The narrative shifted immediately. The board's doubts evaporated. The investor's hesitation disappeared. And my father, he had nowhere left to hide. 2 days later, Roland finally called. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. "Maddie," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, looking out over the city skyline I'd helped reshape. "Do we?" Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, a heavy sigh. "You didn't have to do that." "Neither did you," I replied simply. "This company was supposed to be a legacy," he said. "For the family. For both of you." I felt a familiar twinge of what might have been regret. A tiny, foolish part of me had once wanted that too. But not anymore. "Dad," I said quietly, "if you wanted me to protect the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you tried to take it from me." One more day later. Another long silence followed. Then he asked, his voice carrying a hint of resignation, "What happens now?" I exhaled slowly, watching the city lights begin to flicker on as dusk approached. Now I make sure they can never touch my company again. The war was over. My father had lost. Wesley had disappeared, likely already planning his next venture with his buyout money. And I had won. But as I sat in my office, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a strange emptiness. I had spent 12 years fighting for Thorn Development, building it, protecting it, making it stronger than ever before. Yet the cost of that victory weighed heavier than I had expected. Because while I had secured my position, I had lost something else along the way: my family. The next morning, I walked into the office as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The whispers had stopped. The doubt had vanished. I was no longer just Madeline Thorne, the CEO. I was Madeline Thorne, the woman who had outmaneuvered her father and brother and emerged victorious. Some respected me for it. Some feared me for it. And some still waited for me to fall. I let them wait. At noon, Roland and I met in the conference room for what would be our final discussion. He looked tired, older, as if the weight of the past few weeks had finally settled on his shoulders. I waited for him to speak first. When he did, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I'm retiring," he said simply. "Effective immediately." Conference room. I didn't react. I had expected this. "I'll sell my remaining shares," he continued. "I'll keep a small percentage as an investor, but I won't be involved anymore." I studied him carefully. "And Wesley?" His jaw tightened slightly. "He's gone," my father admitted. "Took the buyout. He won't be back." A part of me had known it would end this way. Wesley had never been one to fight his own battles. Once it was clear he had lost, he had done what he always did: run. Still, hearing it out loud made something inside me ache. Not regret. Not guilt. Just the finality of it all. I nodded. Understood. My father rubbed his temple, as if fighting a headache. Then, after a long pause, he said something I never expected to hear. "I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I would ever get. And strangely, I found that I didn't need it anymore. 1 month later, Thorn Development looked nothing like it had before. The old board members who had aligned themselves with my father and Wesley were gone. The executives who had questioned my leadership were replaced. The company had always been strong under my guidance, but now it was truly mine. And with that control came a new vision. I introduced initiatives my father had always rejected, modernized systems he had deemed unnecessary, expanded into markets he had been too cautious to explore. Within 6 months, our profits soared beyond projections. Within a year, we had crossed the $100 million valuation mark. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just fighting to prove myself. I was building something that no one could ever take from me again. 1 year later, I met Roland for dinner. It was our first conversation since his retirement. He looked different, more relaxed. The anger had faded, replaced by something that looked like acceptance. "I read about the latest deal you closed," he said over his scotch. "The mixed-use development downtown. It was a smart move." I smiled slightly. "I know." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. There was no tension between us anymore. No war left to fight. Only the simple, undeniable truth. He had tried to push me aside, and I had proved him wrong. He lifted his glass. "To Thorn Development," he said. This time, when I clinked my glass against his, I didn't feel anger or resentment. Only peace. Because I had already won. And I no longer needed his approval to know it. Present day. As I sit in my office, overlooking the city I've helped reshape, I think about the lessons this journey has taught me. That family can be your biggest enemy. That loyalty is a currency rather than a guarantee. That power is never given, it's taken. But most importantly, that sometimes the best way to prove your worth is to stop seeking validation and build something so strong that they can never ignore you again. I have no regrets. Thorn Development is mine now. And I intend to make sure no one ever forgets it.